The first speaker is Francesco Botti from the University of Rome, Vergata, and he will talk about the treating with diet and the prevented with diet foods in the Hippocratic glossaries of Erotian and Galen.
Today's speech aims to analyze part of the Hippocratic terminology related to food and nutrition, with particular focus on the therapeutic properties of certain foods and their role in the diet or lifestyle regimen recommended by Hippocratic physicians. The starting point for my investigation will be the Hippocratic glossaries of Erotian and Galen, written about a century apart. These texts are essential not only for expanding our knowledge of certain rare terms, but also for gaining a clearer understanding of how Hippocratic vocabulary was received by later scholars. Erotian's glossary was compiled in the 1st century AD. From the dedication to Andromachus in the proem of the glossary, we gather some information about the chronological period and the context in which Erotian may have worked. It is not possible to determine with precision whether the physician mentioned by Erotian was Andromachus the elder, the Nero's court physician, or his son Andromachus the younger, who practiced the same profession a little later. However, we can reasonably suppose that Erotian was active during the decades between 50 and 80 AD. His glossary is the earliest list of Hippocratic terms that has come down to us. It includes 770 entries, or lemmata, each accompanied by a more or less detailed interpretatio. In addition to glosses with only the interpretamentum, there are others in which Erotian reports explanations of earlier physicians and grammarians. Sometimes quotation from classical authors like Homer, Aristophanes, or Herodotus are used to support certain interpretations, with Erotian serving as a witness of indirect tradition. Originally, the glosses followed the order of succession of the writings of Hippocrates as read by Erotian. This suggests that Erotian's lexicon was conceived as an immediate aid for readers of the Hippocratic text, who could read both the lexicon and the Hippocratic work at the same time. Unfortunately, today all 17 manuscripts that preserve the work contain an epitomized version, where the glosses are rearranged according to an alphabetical sequence that only considers the first letter of each word. Erotian's glossary is one of Galen's main sources, as Galen compiled this Haun lexicographical work about a century later. However, Galen's work is quite different. In his glossary, the entries were arranged alphabetically, since his goal was not to create a tool to be used alongside the reading of the Hippocratic texts, but rather to compile a general lexicon to be consulted independently. While useful, Galen's work is more superficial than that of Erotian. His interpretations are often less detailed, and there are few references to earlier lexicographers or quotation from classical authors. In the glossary of Erotian and Galen considerable space is dedicated to the explanation of terms related to food and nutrition. This is not surprising. Diet and nutrition are fundamental means for the treatment and management of diseases. The regimen takes on a primary therapeutic role. In many words of the Corpus Hippocraticum, doctors don't only prescribe medication, drugs, or surgical interventions. Hippocratic medicine gives great importance on food, which has the ability both to prevent and to cure diseases. The glossaries record about 40 terms for foods. Today, due to time reasons, the analysis will focus on 3 of these entries, also paying attention to the exegetical, lexicographical methods of Erotian and Galen. The first of 3 glosses I have selected concerns the noun mutoton, a hapax legomenon in the Corpus Hippocraticum, found in the second book of the Epidemics. Here, mutotos is recommended to stop bouts of vomiting due to its astringent properties. Ende eme caipe pine mutoton drimiun. If there is vomiting and the patient will not drink, give astringent mutotos. As the image may suggest, this noun refers to a dish commonly known and used among the ancient Greeks. Specifically, a mixture made by pounding together honey, cheese, and garlic into a pasty sauce, a pasty amalgam. Erosion glosses this term and provides several important informations. First of all, he attests to its usage among the Greeks of Attica, oimen Atticoi eupotrim mati metaskorodu ginomenon lebusi, who, according to him, customarily identified mutoton as a garlic-based past. To support this explanation, he cites a passage of Eupolis, tasque varie poiese mutoton poliun, linking mutoton to the word amulon, which refers to a kind of pie or flat bread made with various ingredients. There remain several doubts concerning the citation from Eupolis. The title Lacones, as reported in the Erotian manuscripts, is not attested among Eupolis known words. And that Erotian may have confused the author's name. Bible suggests Plato, the comic Plato, while Meineke proposes Eubulus. Or the title of the comedy. Koch hypothesized that it may have come from the Ilos, another comedy from Eupolis. In the continuation of the gloss, Erosion presents other ancient presentations or interpretations, drawing on additional pre-existing exegetical material. He associated the lemma both with a vegetable-based flatbread, placunta dia lacanum syntetenta, and with a kind of barley decoction known as zeuton, oive ton legomenon zeuton. After listing the various possible meanings of the term, Erosion ultimately agrees with the identification of mutoton as a garlic sauce. In the final part of the gloss, in order to legitimize and reinforce his interpretation, he considers correct, Erosion resorts to etymology. The term mutoton, through the intermediate form musoton, is connected to the expression musatestai ten dusodian, which refers to the sense of disgust caused by a foul odor, the odor of the scorodos. This explains and at the same time justifies the meaning of mutoton, which was perhaps known also for its distinctive smell due to the presence of garlic. In later lexicographical traditions, other sources provide similar interpretation of the term of the food mutotos. Galen, in his glossary, defines it as upotrimma tuo to ek skorodu e chromu, a paste made from garlic or onion, attributing this explanation to Dioscorides Pedanius. Pollux also refers to an astringent garlic-based compound, and similar definitions are found in Hesychius, mutoton eupotrimati diascorodon, and Suda lexicon, eupotrimati diascorodu. Suda, that cite a quotation from Aristophanes' Acarnians, and that mention not only garlic, but also other ingredients such as cheese, apo turu, and eggs, kai u. The second lemma under investigation is the expression alphita proconia. This is another apax in the Corpus Hippocraticum, used in a passage from De Morbus Mulierum 2, to denote fresh flour made from untoasted barley grains. The Hippocratic physician recommends taking this barley flour mixed with water in cases where women suffer from metrorrhagia and lose a significant amount of blood. Kai alphita proconia lepta bibregmena in iudati, eleikein analta. The expression is glossed by both Erotian and Galen. In this case, Erotian's gloss is very generic, very simple. He again refers to the usage of the term among the Attic Greeks, stating that by proconia they mean flour made from untoasted barley grains. Ta ginomena ekthon afructon krithon. Two subsequent glosses by Galen are also of considerable importance. The first from Erotians, both in form and in content, which suggests that Galen may have drawn on different sources in this case. He refers to flour produced before the sheaf is raised. The sheaf is the covone in Italian, so is an instrument for the grain, meaning flour made from new and tender grains. Tha ekton neon eti, kai apalon krithon. The second gloss, Alpha 56 Perilli, is dedicated to the term proconia alone, without alphita, and this time shows a clear connection to Erotian. In his explanation, Galen reaffirms, as already seen in Alpha 72, that the noun referred to flour made from new barley grains, thaekton neon krithon alphita. He also mentions that some scholars, Fines, defined proconia specifically as flour made from untoasted seeds, thaekton afructon mona. It is clear, however, that this interpretation was not shared by Galen, who relegates it to the final part of his gloss and, more importantly, shows no interest to the names of the scholars who have glossed the term proconia in this way. Nevertheless, it is possible to trace the identity of this tiness. Among the tiness mentioned by Galen, erosion himself is certainly included. But who else? Fortunately, a gloss by Hippocrates in the Lexicon Indecem Oratore provides further insight. He associated this interpretation with Aristophanes of Byzantium and Crates, who had, even before erosion, proposed the same explanation. Aristophanes do grammatikos kai Crates ta exafructon krithon uto facin onomazestai. In later lexicographical tradition, the interpretation common to Aristophanes, Crates, and erosion reappears in similar form in other sources, including Pollux, Hesychius, and the Etymologicum Magnum. The third final example concerns the expression analton alphiton, which refers to barley flour without salt. Barley flour, an ingredient we have already encountered as a remedy for uterine bleedings, is also recommended in the first book of Diseases of Women. At this time, however, the woman has to consume this food to avoid becoming pregnant and to ensure that the husband's semen, sperma, having entered during intercourse, exits after a few days. As with the previously discussed entries, Anaton Alphiton is glossed by both Erotian and Galen. However, this gloss represents a special case because it is one of the few examples where Galen's explanation is better than Erotian's. Focusing on the adjective analtos, Erotian glosses it with the expression tho mikron kai anauxes, referring to a flower that is small and doesn't grow. This interpretation doesn't feel well with the meaning of Anaton in Hippocrates, in Diseases of Women 1, and suggests that Erosion may have misunderstood the adjective's meaning, or alternatively, that the original gloss of Erosion was broader and accounted for the various meanings the word could take on in different contexts. The recent scholar of Erosion glossary, the Greek Nikitas, has raised the possibility that Erosion, or his source, derived the interpretation from other lexicographical collection unrelated to Hippocrates, such as a lexicon on Homer or on authors of Old Comedy, who might have used analtos in the sense recorded by Erosion, small and doesn't grow. This hypothesis is certainly plausible given the variety of sources available to the lexicographer. A similar interpretation to that of Erosion is found, for example, in Hesychius, who repeats the pairing analton anauxes. Derives the lemma from alsis, growth increase, rather than als, implicitly explaining the confusion in Erosion gloss. The correct explanation of Hamilton in relation to the Hippocratic text appears in Galen. There are various possibilities. He may have formulated the gloss independently, taken inspiration from Erosion if the original gloss of Erosion was more expensive, or drawn from other sources. The interpretation, thote cori salon caiucal muron, refers to something without salt and not salty, the right meaning in Hippocrates. The entries I have presented today all serve a specific therapeutic purpose. They represent just a small sample to illustrate that diet plays a central role in therapy, according to the Hippocratic physicians, who regarded food not only as nourishment, but as a true instrument of healing, also capable of restoring the balance of the body's fluids and humors. At the same time, discussion around foods provide me a pretext to study more deeply the world of lexicography, and in particular the Hippocratic lexica of Erotian and Galen. They are fundamental for understanding the technical terminology and the dietary references of antiquity, offering valuable descriptions of foods and preparation that might at times be obscure to modern readers. Thank you.
Who is going to which is going to be presented by Adam Morin. And the title is After Bread, Maza is Good Too. Negative Attitudes Towards Barley and Barley Bread in the Byzantine Empire.
All right, well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of the Ceranea Colloquia, or Colloquia Ceranea, I should say, for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to present in front of all of you. And in particular, I would like to thank the esteemed Andrew Dalby. Without his works on classical and food in Byzantium, I would have never been inspired to research food culture in Byzantium myself. So thank you very much for that. It's an honor to be presenting to you today. All right, so today I'm going to attempt to paint a cultural profile of barley, in particular barley bread in Byzantium, a profile which, as we will see, was not particularly flattering to barley quite at all. The 9th century Ignatius the Deacon recounted a curious legal case in a letter 21, addressed to Demochares the Logothetis του Γενικού. Ignatius had been approached by a group of despondent sea captains from the island of Androti, who were in charge of transporting the annual grain shipment to Constantinople, and they were urging Ignatius to intercede for them in their legal woes. The crime was that, facing a shortage of provisions during the voyage, they took some of the imperial wheat to make bread and replaced the difference with barley, for which they were scourged and had their hair cropped and faced further penalties. But this raises an interesting question. Why didn't they simply make bread from their own supplies of barley, rather than stealing the imperial wheat and replacing it with their own barley? Was their aversion to barley bread so strong that they would rather risk legal consequences than to actually eat barley bread at all? Breads formed a clear hierarchy in Byzantium, which seems to have been based on the purity of the flour, defined as being free of bran solids. Most prized among these were breads made from wheat, especially the afraton, a fine and presumably expensive Byzantine white bread. Indeed, the 10th century medical text Peritrophon describes wheat bread as being the best of all foods and the most nourishing, especially if it is pure. And the 11th century physician Simeon Seth concurs with this statement. Afraton's quality was such that it could evoke jealousy in those denied it. Prodromos, in his 4th Tokoprodromic poem, notes ruefully that the superiors of his monastery get fresh afraton sprinkled with sesame, while he must make do with bread of the coarsest flour, rolled in ashes. Although Prodromos' complaints must be taken with a grain of salt, written as they are in an exaggerated satirical style, we actually have other evidence for bread inequality in monasteries. The 12th century typicon of the imperial monastery of Pantocrator in Constantinople notes that the catechumenos of the monastery, because of the many cares and pains of his office, should eat fine afraton bread and drink the best wine daily. Sounds pretty good. And the other monks should not be jealous of this on account of the many burdens of his office. So interestingly, at roughly the same time that Prodromos is complaining about food inequality in his own monastery, here we have a monastic typicon which expressly institutionalizes this food inequality. Other fine wheat breads appearing in Byzantine sources include silingion, which is a term for winter wheat, but also seems to describe the bread made from it, and semidala, which is found twice in the Tokoprodromic poems, and may describe breads made from semidalis, which is wheat flour in general. Again, Tokoprodromos notes with disdain that the superiors of his monastery get to enjoy fresh semidala bread, whereas he must make do with pitorunta, or bran bread. A rank lower than fine wheat breads were the mesocatharon types, which, as the name implies, were of middling purity, described ironically by Prodromos as, quote, bread of the poor, but grammarians and lyricists like himself long for. And below these still were ripuros artos, which literally means dirty bread, piturias artos, bran bread, which was famously requested by the Emperor Michael III of a woman at the baths, along with some white cheese, in Theophanes Continuus, and the despised Chrysinos artos, which is barley bread, as we will see. From a medical standpoint, De Alimentis, which is an anonymous medical tract on foods attributed to the 10th century Byzantine physician Theophanes Chrysovalantis, describes all three types as oligotropha, or poorly nourishing. Ironically, this is the exact opposite of modern dietary beliefs, which hold that brown and whole grain breads to be of far higher nutritional value and often cost than white bread. Barley and barley bread is not treated kindly in Byzantine textual sources. Influenced by a cultural viewpoint which associated coarser, whole grain and barley breads with peasant or low-born populations, the eating of such breads could evoke disgust both to the palate and to the Byzantine sense of self. In particular, a certain sort of animality seems to be associated with the consumption of barley bread, and several Byzantine texts make this connection between barley consumption and animal nature quite plain. For example, George Acropolides, in his 13th century history of the Nicene Empire, described the military commander Constantine Margarides as a peasant born of peasants, reared on barley and bran, and knowing only how to grunt, which seems like quite an animal connotation. Leo, the metropolitan of Synada, complaining about the conditions of his arid Anatolian bishopric in a letter, laments that he must, quote, live like an animal, feeding on barley, hay, and chaff. For the farmland around Synada doesn't even yield wheat, but only barley. The Chronicle of the Logothete, commenting on the dietary habits of the North African Marusii people, likewise notes that they neither produce bread nor wine nor olives, but like unreasoning animals, they eat barley corns and boiled olira, which is a type of like mixed barley and wheat gruel. Likewise, the history of Nicetas Coniatus, which recounts conditions during the sack of Thessaloniki in 1185, characterizes the coarse barley bread that the inhabitants there were reduced to consuming as simply food which sustains the body, in effect, little better than fodder for humans. My theory, and I would love input on this, is that barley's dual-use function as both food for humans and fodder for animals, particularly horses, caused a kind of crisis of identity for those required to consume barley. Wheat and vegetables, after all, apart from some extravagant cases, were not typically fed to animals, which kept the conceptual line between human and animal firm. As we learned from the presentation on seals, Byzantines had an abhorrence for liminal states, so this possibly could feed into that. We have extensive evidence from Byzantine texts, such as the Book of Ceremonies, military treatises, and monastic typica, that barley was commonly used as fodder for horses and pack animals. The letters of the early 14th century Theodoros Hirtakonos shed light on the interplay of barley as both nourishment for horses and humans. In a letter to the Epitukenikleos, Hirtakonos complains that the horse gifted to him by the Emperor Andronicus II has, quote, squandered all the barley and eaten up the rest of my own surplus. And then in a later letter to the emperor, perhaps seeking to make good his lack, he beseeches Andronicus to prevent his impending death and famine and to grant him a gift of barley, this time expressly for his own consumption. Nor is this humanity negating aspect limited to barley. Millet, another grain eaten by both humans and animals, is likewise treated with contempt in Byzantine sources. And I would love to go into this a little bit further, but time constraints. This negative impression of barley is one that had deep cultural roots in Byzantium, dating back to classical Greece. For example, Aeschylus, the 5th century BCE Greek playwright, makes mention of the disgrace of having to eat Maza, which is an ancient term for barley cakes. It was still sometimes used in Byzantium as well, in his Agamemnon. Meanwhile, the Suda, a vast 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia of ancient and classical references, recorded several instances illuminating the low esteem held in classical Greece of barley and barley breads. For example, the entry for the idiomatic phrase agathike maza metarton, after bread, maza is good too, explains it as epitonta defteria didon, in reference to those who give second best. So it's interesting that the very colloquial phrase referring to things that are second best has to do with maza or barley cakes. Regarding maza itself, the Suda points to its dense texture, defining as tough bread, and includes a quote from Xenophon suggesting that one eats barley bread mixed with water, but eats wheaten bread merely moistened with water, which is something of an indictment of its texture. These texts suggest that texture was a key part of the negative attitude towards barley bread. And indeed, barley cakes also appear in Byzantine texts for many non-food related reasons, such as impromptu ballistic weapons and even as construction materials. The Alexiad describes a scene during a naval battle against the Latin Count Preventas, in which, having run out of arrows, an enemy sailor finds a sack of Maza cakes and begins hurling them at the Byzantine admiral Marianos. The Patria, while describing the laying of the foundations of the Hagia Sophia, recalls that barley was cooked in cauldrons, and they mixed the decoction with lime and crushed brick instead of water, for this decoction is sticky, good for mixing, and as an adhesive. They made square barley cakes, 50 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 20 cubits thick, and placed them into foundations, neither too hot nor too cold, but lukewarm, because that way it would be adhesive. And on top of the cakes, they placed big stones of equal length and width, and they could be seen to hold like iron. So it seems like one of the most praiseworthy applications of barley bread in Byzantium was actually in use as a construction material. And actually, one wonders if excavation of the Hagia Sophia today would reveal gargantuan 1,500-year-old barley cakes sitting underneath of it. It might be interesting to see. Despite barley bread's extremely negative cultural impressions, consuming barley bread could actually be praiseworthy and sanctifying in a religious context. Choosing to consume barley bread in lieu of more highly regarded breads was often a conscious way of signaling ascetic religious virtue, which is a theme found in many Byzantine saints' lives. For example, in his youth, Athanasius of Athos, being raised in an affluent family, asked his servant to sell the highly refined wheat bread provided to him, and instead buy 1 fallis, or penny's worth, of barley bread, which he ate only every other day. St. Luke of Styris, who likewise maintained an ascetic dietary regime from childhood, lived only on barley bread, water, vegetables, and legumes. St. Nikon, who ate once a week after communion, went a step further and chose to eat only, quote, a small morsel of barley bread, which was full of mold and old, so that not even in deed and smell did it preserve the quality of bread. Lazarus of Mount Gelasion, while living atop a pillar, ate only barley bread and water. But even this was too luxurious. After 3 years, he eschewed the bread entirely and ate only pulses and vegetables. And this eating of barley bread is not just limited to saints. Those seeking absolution or penance could also choose to consume barley bread in lieu of other breads, as with the rebel leader Bardanius, who, following his failed usurpation of the throne of Nikephoros I, abstained completely from oil, wine, and fish, and chose to make his bread not with wheat, but only with barley, I guess as a way of signaling contrition. By consciously choosing to consume barley breads, an ascetic-minded person could at once ally themselves with the poor, as well as eschew foods more pleasing to the palate, enjoyment of which could place their mortal souls at risk. Thus, in a religious context where consuming food for pleasure was viewed with opprobrium, deliberately consuming such a lowly regarded food as barley bread could be a hardship worthy of sanctification. Now, paksimadi, which is a kind of like twice-baked bread or hardtack, which is usually made from barley, also held many of the same cultural and religious impressions as barley bread, as a humble food eaten by humble people. Famously portrayed as the sole provisions brought by a young, poverty-stricken Justin I during his overland trek to Constantinople from his home village, it likewise featured as a mark of asceticism among religious figures. The life of Maximus the Hut-burner, for example, features a story in which a gluttonous sailor afflicted with a demon of insatiability is cured by a piece of paksimadi which is blessed by Maximus, after which the sailor is satisfied by eating only 1 piece of paksimadi at a time. Even 1 whole paksimadi a day was far too extravagant for the ascetic St. Andrew Salos, who ate only half a paksimadi a day. Along with garlic and onion, a paksimadi was sent to the Emperor John VI Cantacuzene as symbols of the monastic vocation, in an attempt to convince him to make good of his promise to take monastic vows. And indeed, until recently, paksimadi, which is still produced in great quantities in Greece, was viewed as food primarily associated with itinerants and poor islanders, an impression inherited from Byzantium and even earlier. Finally, despite the low perception of barley, it was unquestionably a staple of Byzantine diets, which was essential to institutional and military dining in Byzantium. The Book of Ceremonies, for instance, records that 182 tons of barley was requisitioned from the Thrakision theme for a single expedition to Crete during the reign of Leo VI, and the later expedition, headed by Hymerius, required the same amount of barley, a requisition which was likely split between human consumption and animal feed. Barley makes up a key element of the salaries paid to infirmarians, superintendents, and staff of monastic hospitals, where it was clearly intended to be distributed to patients. Barley given to both the infirmarian and superintendent of the hospital at Pantokrator monastery in Constantinople, for instance, was expressly meant to be used in part for the preparation of medicinal barley juice. So although barley was not seen as particularly nourishing, it had a generally cool humoral profile, and so barley juice would have been considered ideal for treating fevers. We can also discern the importance of barley, at least to Constantinopolitan diets, in a description of the famine experienced in Constantinople in late 743 CE, caused by Constantine V's blockade of that city. The Chronographia of Theophanes Confessor notes the skyrocketing prices of various key staples in the city, the first listed being barley, which cost a staggering 12 nomismata per modios. The Chronicle of the Logothete, meanwhile, describing the same famine, chooses to mention only the price of a modios of barley, confirming its cost of 12 nomismata. Given that barley is mentioned first among other food staples by Theophanes Confessor, such as lupins, mullet, and pulses, and is the only staple mentioned by the Chronicle of the Logothete, it seems reasonable to assume that barley was one of, if not the most important foods sold in Constantinople at the time. And very interestingly, wheat isn't even included on the list by Theophanes Confessor. This shortage must have presented an enormous hardship for Constantinopolitans. It's difficult, if not impossible, to reconstruct quote-unquote normal barley prices, but I actually decided to take a stab at it here. So it's a very rough attempt to reconstruct what a normal modios of barley might have cost. So if we assume that a loaf of barley bread, as requested by Athanasius of Athos at the price of 1 follis, if we assume that that loaf of bread weighed 1 pound, then 20 such loaves, making up a single modius, would have cost 20 follis, or about 1/14 of a nomisma. If 1 modius of barley is selling for 12 nomismata, then that would represent a price increase of a staggering 173 times higher than normal. And that's accounting only for the raw grain and not the improved product of the baker. To conclude, barley, from a Byzantine cultural perspective, was far more than just one grain or bread option among many. It was a marker of socioeconomic modesty, whose taste and texture was to be reviled, and food as fit for animals as humans. Among the more ascetic-minded, this quality was celebrated, which made consumption of barley bread a fitting marker for sanctity and struggle. But among the rank-and-file Byzantine society, including hungry sailors of the imperial grain fleet, it was a misery to be avoided unless necessary. Yet it was necessary, a key component of the diets of everyday Byzantines, as well as its military and institutions. Second best in every way to wheat, this is the cultural fate of barley in Byzantium. Thank you for your time.
Thank you to all speakers for excellent papers. I have a very brief comment for each of you. First of all, Francesco, in the Erotian entry on mutotos, you have a quotation from Eupolis. It seems to be ridiculous to suggest that it might be Plato. If Erotian says it's Eupolis, we should just assume he wrote a play on the Spartans. But I wanted to ask you, I think he also says that mutotos means amulos. I don't understand what he means. Obviously, how he describes it, it's not an unmilled grain, it's a confection. I didn't understand that bit. And for Adam, almost everything you said comes from Galen de Alimentorum that the Byzantine writers are drawing on. And Galen's interested in barley and lesser grains as animal food because peasants have to eat it in times of food shortage. And it has a terrible effect on their digestion. It's a digestive problem as much as anything. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think that the quotation of Eupolis, that Erotian uses the quotation from Eupolis for sustain his interpretation, but he used lexicographical repertory, pre-existent lexicographical repertory material, And maybe my hypothesis is that in Erotian try to explain the meaning of the mutoton or mutotos for Eupolis. So the meaning of the mutotos in Eupolis is kind of pie or flatbread, but for the same for erosion itself is only garlic bread, garlic sauce. So in the gloss of erosion, usually we usually find some errors of interpretation about the quotation of classical authors.
Thank you.
Yes, yes. I would also like to thank you, John, for your pointing out the Galen's De Alimentorum. Yes, Byzantine medical authors, especially with food, often crib quite directly from Galen. In fact, Simeon Seth in his Syntagma de Alimentorum, his chapter on barley is more or less directly copied word for word from Galen. So absolutely, there was a strong Galenic influence there. I would say that. Yes, barley was certainly perceived as having significant digestive and nutritional deficiencies. But I would also say that the level of consumption of barley, which seems to have been the case in Byzantium, may perhaps belie that notion to some degree. Perhaps some of it could have to do with the manner in which it was prepared. But if indeed barley did cause such intense gastrointestinal effects, then a large proportion of the Byzantine populace must have been suffering stomach cramps on a near daily basis.
Thank you.
Now, the question is, I think barley is not very suitable for making bread. You can make beer of it,
Yes,
bread,
yeah.
whatever, but to have a real loaf, there's little gluten in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the bad reputation is also due to the fact that the bread tastes and looks a bit strange.
Yeah, well,
There's still
no question, yeah.
barley bread nowadays.
Yeah. Well,
There is.
There
It's
is.
one of the most favorite kinds of breads.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
but
Well,
it's
exactly.
not
Like Krieg and
exclusively
Patsamadi is
barley.
wonderful. Yeah.
There's always wheat in it.
No.
No, it must be mixed, otherwise it's very difficult. Or you have other leavening substances today.
Well, I've enjoyed Cretan Paximadi on many occasions, and it does have a very distinctive barley sort of flavor to it. Obviously, bread wasn't the only way of consuming barley in Byzantium. It could be made into a kind of a gruel. It could be eaten. The barley corn itself could simply be toasted as part of a alfiton. I chose to focus on barley bread partially because that's where a lot of the most vitriolic sort of attitudes come towards. And it also seems that like Byzantines put a real high premium on the whiteness of a bread, as free from bran solids as possible. And so barley bread would have presented them with just visually with something that would be an extreme departure from what they would consider to be the height of bread. So that alone might have been contributing to that.
Yes, I think it's a class thing because
No question.
barley can be cultivated in very poor soils and it can withstand drought quite a lot, unlike wheat. So it has a very clear class connotation. And I think that many of the comments that we read in the literature are actually have this tint on them. When you talk about feeding your animals with barley, I suppose they mean certain animals like horses.
Horses in particular,
And
yes.
being able to keep a horse means that you are somebody with means.
Right,
So
right.
I suppose one has to see the sources under that light to see who writes for whom. So.
True. Although in the case of Theodore Hyrtakinos, this is very clearly a man who lives in poverty, who also owns a horse, the owning of which is at significant detriment to his own funds or food supplies. Although in his case, the horse was actually gifted to him by the emperor, perhaps unwillingly. there's unquestionably a class component involved with barley bread, and that's it's interesting because yes, of course, barley is a much more high yield grain as compared to wheat and grow in much hardier conditions. But it's also interesting that given how widespread it was, it still retains that sort of shameful aspect to it. And I guess you can kind of compare it to today in that just because the food is widely consumed and widespread doesn't give it any particular prestige. I mean, McDonald's is consumed all around the world all the time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has any particular cachet or prestige in consuming it. Quite the opposite. So maybe something similar is at play with barley. But
I had a question for Francesco. Those foods you talked about, were they commonly eaten at the time when those texts were written? And if they were commonly eaten, then what was the need for such complicated explanations which are contradictory or very confusing?
Thank you for the question. Mutotos and alphiton are common foods in Hippocratic period, in Hippocratic era. But with the time, these terms in time of Erotian and Galen are no longer used and had fallen into disaster. So the same food has a different name. So lexicographers in the 1st or 2nd century AD have some difficulties of explaining what mutotos indicates, while in the Hippocratic era, mutotos is the garlic bread, is the garlic sauce. These terms in time of Galen and Erosion are obsolete. So the meaning of these terms are unclear.
Just a very short comment. First to Francesco. Don't you think that this Krakos is quite possible? Let's take an example of pita, for instance, tiro pita, whichever pita. So methadone, which was quite solid, yeah, could be used as a stuffing inside a Krakos, which is quite reasonable. Yeah, I would say that methadone is something like a relish that was famous and was in vogue. For instance, in the 1st century BC, yeah, and in the 2nd century BC, it was an obsolete thing, yeah, definitely. So I would agree with your explanation. Well, this alloton, yeah, amaloton, this is very hard. And I mean, Galen's explanation is very practical because she says that this is without salt, yeah, unsalted.
Yeah.
And you can find that it's reasonable because when you cook hondros, so what wheat sprouts, usually add pinch of salt, either in fish sauce, but usually you add simply some salt. So unsalted for a pregnant woman, yes, it's quite, say, reasonable. So I would go for Galen's explanation. And to Adam, magnificent presentation of yours. Professor Wilkins mentioned some information from the Elementorum Facultatibus. I would like to remind both of you that Galen said that in his lifetime or earlier, barley was like bird from from military supplies. Mm-hmm. Because of the fact that it was found out not to be nourishing enough. And I mean, high on calories, yeah? Because you mentioned that is good for health, yeah, and pityritus is good for health for some, yeah. If you require something like purging diet, yeah. But if you want to fill your stomach and have a lot of food for your body, it's definitely not good, yeah. So this is an explanation. Theophanes Confessor, you probably noticed that the list is of emergency foods, yeah. So you've got barley, you've got osprey. What else?
It's
millet, yeah.
millet, lupins,
And
pulses,
lupins.
and olives as well.
Yeah, okay, but lupins, they prove it. I mean, my hypothesis, because just to eat lupins, you've got to process them very carefully, because they're bitter.
Well, yes. So we have evidence from two saints' lives, the life of Saint Simeon Salos as well as Antonia Salos, that suggests that lupins were actually sold as a kind of a bar food alongside fusca or wine. And it seems as though the actual processing of it wasn't as necessarily painstaking as we might assume it was. Again, we have a saint's life. I think it's Athanasia of Argos, who describes she lived on a little isolated island for years and years, and when a hunter arrives on the island, notices a little hollowed out part of the ground filled with water in which lupins were floating. So he assumed that some holy man was living there. Later turned out to be a woman. But it seems as though like the processing of lupins, especially in brine, might have been a fairly commonplace, relatively simple thing to do, and also would have been quite easy to be sold as sort of a salty snack alongside bar preparations as well.
I do agree. However, it is not the food for the emperor.
Oh, no
Yes,
question. No question. That
basically,
yeah.
This is just the food you like resort to.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
either you're very poor, so you can buy wheat bread, yeah?
Yeah.
Wheat itself.
That's right.
Or, yeah. And usually, if you don't have a lot of food to eat, you resort to even more painstaking or time-consuming methods in order to fill your stomach. And this is basically just to survive and not to have, like, remove all the bitterness from the dish.
Right, yeah.
So I would stick to this thesis that these are emergency foods, so and lupins as well.
Yes, although I would say also that like one does wonder what percentage of the Constantinopolitan population is eating in such a manner at this time.
I'm not sure, but all around, and this Professor Berger probably would correct me, what the area around and proximity to Asia Minor makes it more probable that wheat was in supply, in limited supply, as definitely you have proven yourself. But it was still this coveted foodstuff, yeah? And why?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Just like aphratos or aphraton, as you mentioned, yeah? One more distinction, semidala or semidalis, it's not just wheat flour or wheat.
Part of the process, yeah.
But this is durum wheat.
Durum wheat, right.
Yeah, and there is a lot of difference between just normal bread wheat and durum wheat, and you can also see it, yet not taste it. And its nutritional value is much higher. It's just harder to break down, as for instance Galen would have said. Yeah. But you can see it because semidalis is yellowish, while wheat bread is definitely white. Yeah. What else? You mentioned those three breads on your list. So it was piterites,
Mesocatron, Piturias,
yes,
and Krithnas.
Yeah. So all of them are of low nutritional content, and they are purging basically. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So these are those things that were prepared from leftovers, and they were for the poor.
Yeah, leftovers or less highly refined flour.
Yeah, but you mentioned something like wholemeal. What was what was the Greek term you used?
Well, bran bread, Epicurus.
Okay, but there was something like the first was Afraton, and the next one was
The next one was Seminada,
and the third one was.
Mesocatherine.
So I would say this is analogy to syncomistos. So basically, wholemeal is syncomistos. When you get riparos and when you get pitivicas, so it means that the bran and the leftovers are in majority in the bread, and this is something which hasn't risen well, just like the one and this is not even the second, but the third rate. So these are some comments, and thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Right. And thank you for your comments. I appreciate them.
And I just wanted to come back a little bit to this barley discussion. I also read this really very brilliant article by Martin Sosha about cereals, and there are all these steps of processing different kinds of cereals. But I've read also in the later Byzantine traditions, therapeutical traditions, Iatosophia, Dinamera, that sometimes one changed also from the bread to the drink. So this barley drink is also very important for being included, I think, in the discussion on thinking about barley. But thank you so much for the great amount of different sources you've showed to us, because this shows that it was not just in therapeutic or dietetic literature very common or very interesting, but it goes through all kinds of literary genre. Thank you so much.
To Adam, I just wanted to say, the translation of Maza always strikes me as a very difficult thing to deal with. I'm not at all sure that it means the same thing to an ancient author, to a late Byzantine author.
Right.
Do you want to comment on that? Or should we discuss
well, I'll just say
later?
that the frequency of usage of the term Maza seems to be quite a bit reduced in the Byzantine era. So it seems as though they're using the term as an allusion to the classical usage of the term.
Yes.
So, for example, it makes sense that Anna Komnena would use the term Maza to describe the sailor throwing the barley cakes at the admiral, because she's consciously writing in an elevated Attic style. So, yes, absolutely, there is some question as to what exactly Maza was. Although there also does seem to be a clear distinction between Maza and Krithnos Artos as well. So, perhaps Maza was a smaller, denser kind of barley cake, whereas Krithnos Artos might have been something more closely resembling bread, but I absolutely take your point that it is somewhat difficult to pin down exactly what Maza is. Although apparently it does make for wonderful foundation laying materials, the Isophia.
Yeah.
So
which have to be sticky.
Which have to be sticky, not too hard, not too cold. That's right. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I have a question for Adam. A comment for Adam. So. I never thought of barley as being hard to digest.
Right.
I made wholemeal barley gruel for my kid and the family for years, and about once or twice a week, and everybody was okay. So if you have a situation like this, where some people say it gives you digestive problems, and some others say no, it's great, then it might be a genetic distinction, so that some genetic groups can digest barley and some others can't. There might be sort of regional clusters as well. And the other point is that barley might be of nutritional advantage if you live in certain parts of the world, that it contains something that you need due to climate, environment, what the water is made of, what kind of water you drink, and so on. Whereas in other parts of the world, it's there are foods that are better suited. Yeah. So that could also be an explanation as to why it is popular in one end of the world, but not in the other.
So it's possible that a sensitivity to barley could be a genetic component, but we also see this similar disparaging of foods in Byzantine sources that we would today consider to be relatively inoffensive. So, for example, Simeon Seth in his Syntagma de Facultatibus Elementorum, he describes oats as being fit only for animals, that no human should consume it because of the intense difficulty of digestion. And oatmeal is something that most of us have consumed on a sometimes daily basis without complication. So it seems to be, and I'm not aware of any genetic predisposition to being unable to digest oats either, although potentially there could be. So it really does seem that, and oats being sort of like another food which is frequently used as fodder for animals, particularly horses. So you really do wonder if the predominance of a particular grain being used as fodder for horses or animals does lend itself to being criticized in a way that it shouldn't be consumed by humans. Like the fact that that's consumed by animals who presumably have a very robust digestion, perhaps lends itself to a bias against consumption of these grains by humans. Just a hypothesis, whether.
Just very short.
I have a little remark to Adam and to Maza, if I can. Especially in the ancient times, Maza means some kind of porridge. That's why Maza is a long word in Latin, giving massa. And I'm wondering if in the Byzantine epoch this meaning continues to exist.
Possibly, although in the Suda entry for Maza, it's specifically described as tough bread.
Not porridge.
Not porridge, no.
But the Suda is Byzantine.
That's right. It is Byzantine, but like
Antiquarian.
it's antiquarian, right? So it's sometimes they will give Byzantine. Sometimes they will describe these things according to what their understanding of it was. So it's possible that if by the Byzantine era Maza then refers to a barley cake, they may have been unaware that it was originally referred to a kind of gruel.
May I just, very short comment. Could you explain what you mean by barley cake? So,
yes.
One thing.
Okay.
Another one, I would strongly protest against interpreting Maza as porridge. Mm-hmm. Because the very nature of it could help it be transformed into sort of porridge. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't baked, it wasn't cooked. So just normal Maza was just like kneaded alfita, so barley crowds, with some addition of water, and of course other things if you could afford. And you had it at hand, like for instance salt, like for instance some oil, like for instance some honey, defrutum, so hepzema, or whatever you had. And then you could form from it something we know nowadays very well. When you go to a shop and you are a fit-minded person, you take a bar of something, yeah? And probably Maza was very similar to those bars. They are with different seeds and almonds and so on and so on. Right. Glued in the same way as, because barley is sticky, yeah? So this is this sort. And of course, if you put it into water and you boil it, you can cook it into a sort of porridge. Right. But basically this is something that lasts for ages. And it's very hard, so that's why you can throw it sometimes.
That's right. Yeah.
So this is saying my concept. And may I just, what Botti said and what you explained. Come on, oats and barley is beasts' food.
Right.
Yeah. and it's bad as it's by Simeon described as a grain, as cereal, because you got to know that all cereals are very hard to break down, and they are very hard to break down. So once processed, they become something that is okay. And you've got ptisani, which is barley soup, not barley porridge, okay? But barley soup. But you can have ptisani with or without barley, based on oats. And this is, as far as I remember, Professor Wilkins, could you correct me, greatly appreciated by Galen. So this is okay. And coming to bread, I know what maza is in Poland. And this is something like flatbread or radi wafer, which is prepared from barley flour, yeah? And this is okay because it's cooked. Of course, it's uneven, but it's quite easy to transform it in our bowels into something like food, and this something would be appreciated. But what Professor Becker said, could you imagine something like very flat bread, but with a lot of dough, which doesn't rise, or if it does, inside you've got something like sticky gluey substance, which is really very hard to digest. Just try to have something like, for instance, a cake at home, and sometimes it's not well risen, and if what's inside, sometimes it might be very healthy. But then you can feel something like heart and stomach, or something like, for instance, inflated hypochondria. So that means that you will have some problems with processing it in your blood. So basically, this bad opinion about barley bread is about bread that is prepared in the same way as wheat bread, which lost its bad influence due to yeasts, due to salt, which made it very, very highly appreciated, not from the point of view of taste, but also from the point of view of it being easily digested, broken down into bowels. Okay. Yeah. So this was my too long explanation.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. Truly, there are many variables at play when discussing digestibility of foods, preparation, etc. And I think to respond to your question, I think your characterization of maza probably comes closest to what I would picture a maza to be. Some sort of a smaller cake made of more whole barley grains, possibly with some other things mixed in with it. But yeah, something like an ancient Cliff Bar, so to speak. Yeah, so something small, dense, made of full grains, possibly mixed with other ingredients to add flavor or texture. But yeah, definitely small, dense, and something different from what I'd imagine a barley bread to be. Although Paksamati kind of like bridges the gap between those two in a sense. Very hard, dry, but yet slightly chewy barley bread. But at any rate, yeah.
But we can also even imagine the size of this maza.
Well, they're clearly fist size.
Yeah, not necessarily. It's part of. And Judabi could correct me. There was this habit of preparing something like a special treat. It was barley alfita, which were enveloped in something like a sort of a leaf. And if they were enveloped in a sort of a large leaf, so it could have been just this size. Mm-hmm. And that means that my comparison with a bar, for instance, a very popular brand here, which is called Corny, would be just applicable. So thank you.
I want to thank all the speakers, colleagues, the discussion, and now we process to coffee.